And so we're thrilled to have Barroness Cox back again and Pierre Prosper tomorrow with us for this year's symposium. So it's a great couple of days. We want to encourage you as you start moving in, as things get going here, to take a seat. And we also have the note cards out, as you've seen in typical Pepperdine fashion, that you can write your questions as the event goes on and pass those to the end of the row, and we'll have somebody coming by to collect them. And Roger Elford will moderate a conversation after Barroness Cox presents her presentation. He'll moderate a conversation and those questions. So as we get going, we're going to show a quick 5-minute video on some of the highlights from this past year with the Global Justice Program that our students have been making throughout the world.
Huh? Nothing, I was just saying when I'm hard.
I will try to make you to understand. For our curriculum, it is very dark, and we don't see the hope. But we hope that someday there will be a light in our current state, and that we will get freedom. Then we go back to our current state.
Does he live out here?
อยู่กับครอบครัวที่นี่เหรอคะ Oh, they live over there. ครอบครัวมีพ่อแม่น้องพี่น้องหรือเปล่า
มีครับ
ก็ Daria's mom, dad, and siblings.
สูบโลดมาสูลินี่เหรอครับโทงเรียกกระบองน้ำสดอ๋อมาสู
This summer I worked at the Thai-Burma border with the Free Burma Rangers as advocacy intern. Pepperdine, along with the Free Burma Rangers, has been working to address the human rights abuses that the Burmese junta has been perpetrating against the ethnic peoples that live in the hills of Burma. In my capacity as advocacy intern, I spent time at the refugee camps in Mela, interviewing refugees and designing the advocacy campaign for 2009.
Hi, my name is Jesse Clark, and this year I've been able to work at the Rwandan Ministry of Justice in the Government Contracts Division. And the experience I've had here has just been incredible. It's been fantastic on my CV, being able to work on everything from World Bank reports to contracts with Western companies.
Hi, my name is Matt Malarkey. I'm a 3L at Pepperdine University School of Law. I'm currently working here in Kigali, Rwanda for the Attorney General's Office in the Legal Advisory Department. Currently working on contracts, multi-million-dollar contracts, international treaties, drafting and analyzing provisions for legislative acts.
Hi, my name is Weston Kreider. I'm a rising 3L at Pepperdine University School of Law. Since I've been in Rwanda, I have been working for the Commercial High Court, which is about a year and a half old, and mostly I've been dealing with issues of instituting the common law here in Rwanda. Things I've dealt with have included banking issues, consumer protection, and that kind of thing. And more recently, I've moved to the Supreme Court, working for Deputy Chief Justice Sam Rugege. And since I've been there, I've been working with all kinds of issues in the common law, but more specifically, I've been comparing foreign law, U.S. law, to Rwandan law to hopefully instruct them in how they can deal with some issues.
We have just concluded our visit to the Yuma displaced persons camp, where we saw the most wonderful little children in this camp, which once hosted as many as 45,000 people who were displaced by the terrors of the war. The war led by a very odd organization called the Lord's Resistance Army, which had little to do with the Lord, but a lot to do with resistance. All of these, literally several 100,000 people at the high water mark, were displaced by this internal strife, which has been such an endemic problem for sub-Saharan Africa.
When these parties come and you try to tell them that this case cannot go to court, let us handle it locally.
Oftentimes women are faced with conflict because they're looked at as property under the customary setting. Bread price is normally paid, and therefore they cannot be seen to own property because they are bought and they are also deemed as property.
My name is Justice Geoffrey Kidiabwire. I am a judge of the Commercial Court in Uganda, which is a division of the High Court of Uganda. I also coordinate the program between the Ugandan judiciary and Pepperdine University School of Law, where we have interns who come and spend about 2 months of their summer holidays with us, working with judges and helping us to do our work by providing research capacity and also helping us with some of the projects that we're trying to put in place to improve our own work efficiency and effectiveness. This year I had 2 interns. I had Marie and I had Ali. These were extremely helpful people, and I think they also have been able to learn from us how we do our things, and more importantly, get a different perspective of how legal practice is in another part of the world.
It's a wonderful experience. I have to say we're just so lucky to be able to participate in this opportunity. We are able to do anything from sitting on court to work on case briefs to participate in a pension conference in addition to other research that we have helped Justice Kidiabwire with. It's been a wonderful experience to have that mentorship ability with a justice and a law student, which isn't always such an easily accessible position in the States, and we are so lucky to have this genius with us who is teaching us wonderful things and learning about the law not only in Uganda but in England and Commonwealth countries as well.
Coming out here to Uganda and doing this, I think I've partly rediscovered why I wanted to be a lawyer, and it's been a great experience that I would recommend for everyone. Thank you.
What are your names?
My name is Avadure.
Avadure? I'm Jay. You are?
Adong Ari.
Adong Ari? Nice to meet you too.
We
walking this way. What?
To fail me.
What?
We want you to fail me.
One of the reasons our students do this good work is because of the role models that we look up to, those who encourage us by their example and those who encourage us directly by their mentorship. Barroness Cox has been both to our students. This is the second time that we've had the privilege to welcome Barroness Cox to Pepperdine. She's an incredible woman, as you'll learn today, and she's known throughout the world as the voice of the voiceless, acting on behalf of human rights in some of the most remote and dangerous places in the world. She's visited the oppressed in southern Sudan, redeeming thousands of slaves in the process. She's visited the Armenian enclave in Nagorno-Karabakh during the height of its war and started a rehabilitation center there to serve those wounded. And close to my heart, she's crossed illegally many times into the war-torn jungles of Burma to visit the Karen people and bring hope. And while continuously traveling the world, Barroness Cox has found time to serve as Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords in British Parliament, where she continues to serve as a crossbench member. She also founded and continues to run an NGO named HEART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, and she's received numerous awards for humanitarian work, including the prestigious William Wilberforce Award. But to us at Pepperdine, she's been a very, very close friend. 2009 alumna Carrie Doherty picked up Barroness Cox at the airport a few years ago on her last trip, and that drive from LAX blossomed into a friendship. And during Carrie's time as a student here at Pepperdine, she traveled with the Baroness to numerous places, including northern Nigeria, to visit the religiously oppressed and document burned churches, and more recently to Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh to visit the war-torn country there. And the most striking thing that Carrie told me from her experience traveling with the Baroness was that throngs of people would swarm to her, and just in admiration of the things she had done there, and her great works in these countries. And they would be just shocked to see these people in remote areas just identifying Barroness Cox and coming up to her and just loving her. So I think, and I trust that you will, as well as these people in remote countries, feel the same today after meeting her. So please stand with me and welcome Barroness Cox.
Well, thank you so much for that very embarrassing introduction. I hardly recognize myself, but it's a great joy to be back here at Pepperdine. It was lovely to travel with Carrie. She was an absolute star. And I hope some of you may also join me in some of my travels to some of the places where we're working. Because the real heroes, the real heroines, nothing to do with me. They are our brothers and sisters who are our partners in some of the darkest parts of the world. And they're the ones who are holding front lines of faith and freedom for the rest of us. And whenever I travel to be with our brothers and sisters in some of those dark parts of the world, I always return so humbled and inspired by their faith, their courage, their dignity, and indeed miracles of grace which we encounter when we're with them. So this afternoon, I'm going to ask you, if you will, to travel with me in imagination to meet some of those, and we'll spend most of our time in Burma, because it's lovely to find some of you who've been and shared some of the experiences I've been privileged to have with the very courageous people who are suffering attempted ethnic cleansing or cultural genocide in that beautiful but tragic land. But we'll also touch on, as you have done in that very beautiful and powerful video, one or two of the other areas where we're also currently working. But before we begin our travels together, I'd like, if I may, to introduce myself to those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting before in a rather more modest way than your embarrassing introduction. Because all I ever say about myself is I'm a nurse by primary profession and a social scientist academically. So I'm a nurse and a social scientist by intention and a baroness by astonishment. And you get to be a baroness in Britain these days by being appointed to our upper house in Parliament, the House of Lords, the equivalent of your Senate. I wasn't born a baroness. Indeed, I was so much out of that world that I was the first baroness I'd ever met. So, if you've not met a baroness before, well, join the club. But what I do cherish, of course, is the privilege of being able to speak in one of the houses of the British Parliament for people who cannot speak for themselves, whether as a nurse on behalf of vulnerable people in our own country, but increasingly on behalf of forgotten peoples in forgotten lands, such as our ethnic national friends inside Burma and other countries. And many of those happen also to be Christians. There is Christian persecution on a mega scale, bigger than ever before in human history. Over 250 million Christians are suffering some kind of persecution around the world today. But I'm a Christian myself, and of course our Christian mandate requires us to try to heal the sick, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, speak for the oppressed, regardless of their faith. It doesn't say just speak for the Christian oppressed. We have to be available for all with unconditional love. And that's what we try to do in our small humanitarian organization, HEART. Now, in a moment, if I can possibly get the PowerPoint to work, I'd love to move to PowerPoint. I've pressed the forward. Oh, here we are. And I'm in the right place. It's good to know. But very briefly, the motto of the hospital where I trained as a student nurse about 100 years ago was translated from the Latin, "I must be concerned for all humanity." But we in Heart, we try to provide aid and advocacy for those who are suffering particularly oppression and persecution and who are largely neglected by the major aid organizations. We're not just another humanitarian organization, and I don't mean to diminish or demean humanitarian organizations. Of course, they carry out essential work, but we are a little bit distinctive, a little bit unorthodox, indeed perhaps a little bit deviant. But I'm no stranger to deviance. For example, there are a lot of aid organizations who do very precious work. There are very good advocacy organizations, such as Anti-Slavery International. But we, working with people who are suffering from oppression and persecution, and largely off the radar screen, believe that they need both advocacy and aid. So we do combine the two. We genuinely work with local people. This is something I feel passionately about, helping them to make a difference for their own communities. In other words, we don't go in with expat teams and plant ourselves on the ground. We go alongside local people, and we work with them genuinely as partners, helping them to make that difference for their own people. And part of that is to ask them to identify their own priorities. I was in southern Sudan earlier this year, and one of the local officials there said, "Why don't aid organizations ask us what we need instead of telling us what they're going to do?" And I believe that is immensely important. It's very arrogant just to go in and tell someone you're going to provide primary health care or a school. They may need that. But much more important to get alongside them and say, what is your priority? And then try and enable them to achieve their own identities, their own priorities. Give them that dignity of choice. We often work in places where other major aid organizations will not or cannot work. Now that situation occurs because the big aid organizations, the names we would all know, like the UN, UNHCR, UNICEF, Save the Children, Red Cross, etc., can only go places with the permission of a sovereign government. And if a sovereign government is victimizing a minority in its own borders, as indeed happens in Burma, and doesn't give permission to the major aid organizations to reach those victims, then those big boys can't go. Where we're small, we're deviant. I spend a lot of my time crossing borders illegally and absolutely shamelessly. Sorry to say that in the Department of Law, it's embarrassing, isn't it? But I don't believe that people should be left unreached, unhelped, unheard, and it's the only way to reach them is to go in sometimes somewhat unofficially. And I know some of you here have done that yourselves in Burma, crossing over, I think, from Mae Sot into Burma itself. So you can't be too critical of me. We're all doing it together. And our work is often actually of quite strategic significance because we are working precisely in those areas which are of immense strategic importance. And our advocacy can really be a great asset for people who are on those front lines. So, just to summarize, our mission is to provide appropriate, because we ask them what their aid is required, appropriate aid to those who have recently been suffering oppression and persecution. And our priority, just to reiterate, is to focus on the forgotten peoples in the forgotten lands, often trapped behind those closed borders, not served by the major aid organizations, unreached, unhelped, unheard. And very briefly, our founding principle is what we call the 4 A's. They're all interrelated. Authenticity, the enormous importance of going in person, both to underpin the aid, as I've said, asking the local people their priorities, enabling them to make their own difference for their own people. But also authenticity to underpin our advocacy. Those of you who are lawyers, so important. And in the Houses of Parliament, I know that the House does listen to me, and ministers will say it at the dispatch box. You know, we listen, forgive this strange terminology, to the noble Baroness, because we know that she's been, and she's bringing us information that we wouldn't get by any other means. So you need to go to be authentic, to underpin authentic advocacy. And accountability, primarily to those for whom we speak, that our message is accurate and sensitive, but also to those who support our work, that they know what we've done with what they made possible. So that's who we are. Come travel with me to a land which many of you here know and care about as I do. Those of you who know about Burma will know that that brutal regime with a lovely name, SPDC, the State Peace and Development Council. George Orwell couldn't have done better, could he? It is such a contradiction of the truth. Anyhow, that military junta uses its power to carry out brutal crimes against humanity, targeting its own civilians in what it calls a counterinsurgency strategy that, as many of you here will know, directly contravenes humanitarian law. May I just say that since I was here last time, and it's lovely to be back, in Britain, a couple of years ago, we celebrated the bicentenary of William Wilberforce's parliamentary achievements in the United Kingdom, when he and his colleagues managed to bring in a law which would abolish slavery, or the slave trade, in the British Empire. Now, that was a very historic time in Britain, but I was a bit worried, because I was afraid we'd spend all the time looking back. Now, I personally don't feel I can apologize for what other people did in another era. Maybe you feel you can, something to discuss. But what I can apologize for is what I don't do in my day. And I think William Wilberforce would want us, rather than looking back, but to look at his unfulfilled mission. And there are still at least 27 million men, women, and children around the world today suffering some kind of slavery and servitude. And I felt that they're the people we should target. But it's difficult to get your heads around 27 million. So the heart of this book are 3 chapters which are the stories, the personal stories of people into whose eyes I have looked, who have suffered today's slavery in one form or another. They are heartbreak stories, but the voices of those people who have been today's slaves speak for those whose voices we cannot hear because they are still enslaved. Those chapters with the personal stories, and I could have multiplied by hundreds, I'm sorry to say, come from Burma, people who've suffered the forced labor, which you'll have heard the Karen people talking about, that are subjected on their people, the sexual slavery, the way that SPDC regime uses rape as a weapon of war, very authoritative reports from the Shan people, their report from the Mon people, catwalk to the barracks, from the Karen people, shatter the silence. The child soldiers, I don't know if you know the report, my gun was as tall as me. Very authoritative reports of the various violations of human rights carried out by that brutal regime against its own people. Excerpts from those reports are documented in this book, together with some of the heartbreak stories of people who suffered the slave labor, the sex as a weapon of war, the boy soldiers, and so on. So that's one of the case study chapters in this book. I'm going to donate it to your library, if I may, so you'll be able to access it if you so wish. The others, and this will be of relevance to some of you who've been in Uganda, there are some of the stories here from the kids who suffered the horrendous atrocities inflicted on them by the Lord's Resistance Army, which was referred to in your very powerful video. And there are also stories from people who've suffered slavery in Sudan. So that is some of the further detail behind that general statement, and you can access it in that book. But here we go, and some of you may well have done this journey, crossing over illegally, sadly, shamelessly, from Thailand into Burma. Dramatically beautiful, as those of you who have done it know. You can't help being exhilarated by the beauty, can you? It is so beautiful, but you feel almost guilty being exhilarated by that beauty, because the reason you're there is you're crossing into a land which is a heart of darkness, and the reason you're there is the suffering of the people. Just one or two facts that many of you here will know this, but since 2006, at least 30,000 Karen people, that's since I was here last time. Since I was here last time, at least 30,000 Karen people have had to flee the military junta's attacks on their villages and take what I can only call the long road to nowhere. Where do they go? There's nowhere for them to go except to hide, displaced, in danger and perpetual peril and discomfort and deprivation in the jungle, or to cross the border into those overcrowded camps which you've just seen pictures, such as Melar Camp and many others strung across the Thai side of the Thai-Burma borders. And just the terrifying figures which I got just 4 days ago to update for my presentation to you. 450,000 now, Karen, Karenni and Shan people have been driven from their homes to live as the internally displaced peoples in the jungles of eastern Burma. 450,000 are living like that now. In those jungles, they can't build permanent dwellings, they can't light fires, SPDC soldiers will see the smoke and come and kill them. They can't get regular medical care, wonderful work Free Burma Rangers does, trying to access many of them in the jungle. But they're spread out, and as one person said to me rather ruefully, we can't wait until the FBI comes maybe on Tuesday when we step on a landmine, or we can't wait till they come to get malaria. Their condition is dire, and 150,000 have fled into those overcrowded refugee camps in Thailand. The Karen, let's visit with me for a moment, the Karen, a gentle people, as you all know, a typical young carrying younger. Sorry, I seem to have lost my, again, as you will know, that regime is carrying out military offensives. It's shelling the Karen villages, and of course, jungle territory, wooden dwellings, they just go up in smoke. It's going on all the time, this constant shelling. And one thing made me particularly sad, we used to cross over when we were in Mae Sot. We used to go down to the border and cross over into a little Karen settlement on the other side at La Poher. And there was a wonderful teacher there called Rainbow. If I have time, I'll tell you a story about Rainbow. But every year we would go and take over supplies for his school and support the kids over there. But since we were there last year, even La Poher has fallen to SPDC or DKBA troops. And I gather even that little township is now burnt to the ground. There's the thing I meant to point this to. Oh, here we are. When the SPDC attack, they'll also destroy food supplies and or they'll lay mines. So if people try to go back to their villages to get food, either it would have been destroyed or they run the risk of being blown up. The SPDC will destroy any livestock that they find. I love kids. They always find somewhere to play, however dire the circumstances. But this is an example of what I could only call a miracle of grace. I met Marsu, age 38, on the very first time I went to this part of the world. Her village had been attacked, a lot of the homes had been burnt, her home had been burnt to smithereens. She'd lost everything. Then after the attack, the soldiers just ran through, just shooting civilians gratuitously. Marsu was shocked. She's recovering from her wounds, but they're quite grievous. You can't see the ones on her back. But she got that wonderful smile. And when we asked her what she felt about the soldier who shot her, her reply was very simple. She just said, I love him. It says in the Bible, we must love our enemies, so of course I love him. He is my brother. Doesn't that make me feel microscopic in my spiritual stature? To love the soldier who shoots you, to call him your brother. But isn't it also the power of Christ's transforming love, that it can take that brutality and turning it into that kind of forgiveness and love? So Marsu is one of my heroines. Sometimes we ask the kids if they can draw what they feel. We've got lots and lots of children's drawings. If you ever come to us in London, I can show you. Haven't got time this afternoon. This is just one example. But sometimes it's easier to talk about something painful, to draw it, than to talk about it. So that's why we ask the kids sometimes to draw their feelings. And this little one says it all, in English actually. Little kid, in English, I am very sad. That long road to nowhere. When the SPDC attacks those villages now, whether it's in Karen, Karenni or Shan states, they adopt a shoot-to-kill policy. You have to get out or you are slaughtered. You have to leave your village, your paddy field, your water buffalo, everything you've got. Just take with you what you can on that long road to nowhere. Just walk with me for a moment with these Karen who've had to flee from their villages on that long road to nowhere. Goes on, that long road to nowhere. Resting on the long road to nowhere. Crossing rivers. And in the winter, or in the rainy season rather, those rivers can be swollen, carrying your baby on your back. People drown crossing those rivers, and sometimes their babies drown with them. Climbing out, soaking wet. If you've been there, you know at night you can get quite cold, especially high up in the mountains inside Burma. Can't light fires, so soaking wet, cold, no home, no shelter. Horrendous condition for those IDPs. The face of anguish on that little one. Here we were in one of the safe camps right on the border, still inside Karen state, but right on the border with Thailand. And I think this is a very poignant little picture. I couldn't resist taking it. This little girl just helping her family build a new shelter. It can't be home. They've had to leave home with all that home meant, but somewhere to live. but they won't have land to plant any vegetables, to be able to keep any animals. They're exiles in their own land. Here are the FBR, wonderful people, looking after a mine injury victim in the jungle, and they are such brave people, and I do admire Free Burma Rangers. They take in medical teams, backpack medical teams inside Burma to try to look after the IDPs in the jungle, treating a mine injury here. And moving quickly, because I want to leave time for questions, but from Eastern Burma, and may I just say in heart, our primary focus of work is now with the Shan peoples. We do a little bit to help the Karen, but there are a lot of people who are helping the Karen, and they need all the help they can get. The Karenni, the smaller tribe to the north of Karen state, we help with the backpack medical teams there. But those do come within the remit of the Thai-Burma Border Consortium, so they do get some help from the international community. The Shan people, a Buddhist tribe and a very large tribe to the north, don't get actually helped by the Thai-Burma Border Consortium. So for heart, we are focusing predominantly on the Shan. The Shan Swan organization, Shan Women's Action Network, a lovely group. They're Buddhists, they're delightful, they're gracious, and particularly their people have suffered not only military offensives, but the very systematic use of rape as a weapon of war. So we help with maternal and child health and clinics and women's issues with the Shan. So that's the eastern side. Moving briefly to Western Burma, one of the things I used to challenge the TBBC about was that, okay, they are helping on the east, but what's happening to the people in need on the western side of Burma? There's no Burma Border Consortium there at all. People of Chin State are the hill tribes in northwest Burma, and they are suffering big time. They're occupied by SPDC. They signed an agreement, so they're not fighting, but they're occupied. And that's almost worse, because it means there are SPDC units in every village, that the people are always vulnerable to forced labor, to rape, to extrajudicial killings, to torture. So they are really suffering big time from the point of view of occupation by SDBC troops. But also, nature has conspired alongside man to cause them additional anguish. Because there's a lot of bamboo in Chin State, about 600,000 people live there, and about 140,000 are affected by a famine caused by the fact that every 50 years, the bamboo inconveniently flowers. And the bamboo goes into flower, the rats just love those bamboo flowers. So they get this massive infestation of rats, a plague of rats, who come in and devour everything. Sometimes big aid organizations make me furious. World Food Programme, WFP, lives in Rangoon, probably compromised by Rangoon, but went up initially to Chin State and didn't go to the areas where the people rely on bamboo. They went to the non-bamboo areas, of course didn't find any famine, so denied the existence of a famine in Chin State. Well, we knew there was a famine. So September last year, we took what was a lot of money for us up there to provide some food for some of the people as an interim measure. But more important, we invited a BBC journalist with us who got the evidence of famine, broadcast it on the BBC World Service, that forced World Food Programme to change its position. And in answer to a question I asked in the House of Lords last October, DFID, that's our equivalent of your USAID, Department of International Development, promised £600,000 for food relief. Well, that was, if you like, a sort of encouraging example of where aid and advocacy can come together. If we hadn't been there to get the advocacy, we wouldn't have had the evidence to challenge the World Food Programme, and we wouldn't have had a case to make the British government for the genuine need for food relief. Still very difficult to get it there. Some villages have still not received it, but at least we're working on it, and many have received help. But very briefly, if you don't like rats, shut your eyes for the next 3 slides. The evidence, the rats, the devastation they cause, they devour everything. And this poor farmer, as so many, has tried to do something to protect his crops, put out some rat traps. But you can't do anything when there are thousands and thousands of rats. So the face of famine, or rather the swollen abdomen of famine. But a little personal happy story in the sense of a tribute to a very special young man. His tribal name is Sasa. Sasa was brought up in the Chin Hill tribes of Burma. He saw the most awful things happening to his people when he was a kid. There's no health care for those Chin Hill tribes. You'd see women dying in childbirth, maybe a breech that couldn't be delivered, they'd kill the baby in utero and the mother and baby would die, or people dying of malaria, no health care. He determined to try to become a doctor. And it's a long story. I hope you meet Sasa one day. He'd be a good person to invite here. He's got amazing stories, how he went 14 days to Rangoon, studied high school in Rangoon without learning Burmese. Well, had to learn Burmese, but had a really tough time there. And then all the villagers clubbed together and sold everything they had to raise money for him to go across the border into India to study his preclinical sciences. When he was in India, he learned there was a Christian country called Armenia where he could study medicine cheaper than in Britain or the US. And I first met Sasa in Armenia, speaking fluent Armenian, his sixth language, but not looking the least bit like an Armenian. Comes from Chin Hill tribes of Burma. And he'd been away from his home, couldn't go back for years. I kind of adopted him as a son, and he came over to Britain in the vacations, had clinical experiences in Britain, graduated, I'm happy to say, last June, and with honours, amazing, in your sixth language you study medicine, honours in medicine, surgery, and obs and gynae. And he's just returned to that borderland of Chin State and India to establish a healthcare program, beginning a training program for community health workers. And they're coming all out from villages deep inside Chin State to learn primary healthcare. He's enterprising. He's got 350 copies of the seminal textbook, Where There Is No Doctor, which I've used in remote areas in Sudan. But it's translated into Burmese, taken up by river to begin a training program for people who will go back to take healthcare where currently there is none. Wonderful people we meet. Here is Sasa, going back to be with his people. If anyone wants to come up and meet us and work with Sasa up there for a short time on the western side of Burma, he'd love to have your company. You don't have to be a medic. There's so much you can do just being there. Anyway, very briefly, I just want to flick through one or two of the other areas we're working, put them on the agenda, not to go into any detail, but you did talk about Uganda and Rwanda. I just want to flag up, especially for those who are concerned with law or humanitarian issues, Sudan. Sudan, Africa's largest nation, has suffered civil war for most of the years since independence. The situation became drastically worse in '89 when an Islamist regime, it's a kind of ideology behind 9/11, took power by military coup, declared Islamic military jihad against all who oppose it, a horrendous, horrendous war. 2 million dead, 4 million displaced in that war. Just very briefly, those figures there. A comprehensive peace agreement was signed in 2005, but the needs are still legion, and also it is extremely precarious. But of course, when that happened, the conflict erupted in Darfur. Now, in southern Sudan, it is a hellhole. Only 17% of the population have an immunization program. There's leprosy, the needs are legion, and also Khartoum is beginning to manipulate conflict down again in the south, and there's a real fear that war is going to erupt again. So what are we doing? Very briefly, just a few pictures from the war. We won't go into details now. It was scorched earth policy. It was attempted genocide. As I say, 2 million perished, 4 million displaced. Slavery. Slavery is a weapon of war. This brave guy tried to stop the regime in the north taking a boy as a slave. I was there when the slave raids were going on. Tens of thousands of women and children taken into slavery. Some of their stories are in that book on slavery. Little Deng, this guy, their stories are in the book, so I'm not going to waste time this afternoon, but there are still thousands of women and children missing in Sudan as slaves. This guy had escaped from slavery. I met him last year after 21 years as a slave. Girl taken at the same time in this village has still not been seen. But needs is their legion. There is still peace. We can do humanitarian work there. Look at this lady's cheeky little smile. Isn't she wonderful? Look at her hand. Advanced leprosy. What a privilege to hold that hand. I try and follow in the example of St. Francis. I'm a third order Franciscan, and one of St. Francis' sayings, which I think is very significant, pity weeps and turns away. Compassion weeps, puts out a hand to help. What a privilege. And many of you are doing that in your respective ways. It is a privilege, isn't it? We have so much. We can make a difference. But very briefly, education is a priority. These lads are looking at all that remains of their school. We're hoping to build a new school up there in Bara Ghazal. And it's very important to get education for girls. Culturally, it's not a priority. So our wonderful head teacher here has designed a school for girls, which boys may attend. Very good. Here he is. And the girls all go, because it's a school for them, and the boys go too. But what a privilege to make a difference. If I could get this to work, it would be lovely. Orphans, many mine injury victims. These little ones, their mother was blown up in a mine. The little one lost his leg, as you can see. He now has an artificial leg. I may say he plays very good football with his artificial leg. And if we can move on. Thank you. With it. Primary health care. We asked the local people again what are their priorities. They say, please, healthcare. People are dying from measles, meningitis, and it doesn't cost much money. The local people do it. We go to celebrate the opening of their clinic, not a heart clinic. And this is really what it's all about, enabling people to help themselves. And as we leave Sudan, there's a president of southern Sudan who is really asking for advocacy and help on a big scale as his people face potentially another war. And what we're doing there, restoring a devastated infrastructure of primary healthcare clinics, we've seen that, we've seen the school. On the advocacy side, pressing our own government to urge Khartoum to free all remaining slaves. Please would you write to your own members of Congress or senators and ask them to raise at Khartoum the issue of all the slaves still stuck there in Sudan, and promoting advocacy, which I'm doing this afternoon. Very, very briefly, as you move on, take that picture in your hearts. Two little faces, a photo I took last time, one of despair, one of desperate hope. Very briefly, northern Nigeria, much needs your advocacy and your concern. Much of Nigeria, peaceful, prosperous. The north, caught up with hardline Islamist militancy. Sharia law already in 12 states, and a lot of conflict and a lot of attacks on Christians. Churches, hundreds of churches have been destroyed. Anglican Church in Plateau State. This is the University Church in Jos in Plateau State, burnt last November in an attack when hundreds of Christians were killed and many churches destroyed in Jos. They'll still worship, even in the midst of the ruins. To God be the glory. This house is not for sale is not ironic. After their homes have been destroyed, sometimes the Muslims who are trying to take over will go in and offer to buy the homes, so they'll resettle that part of a town or a village. The Christians have got nothing to restore their homes with, but they're digging in. They're just saying, we are not selling. This was a young Roman Catholic mum. Her church was burnt. She was attacked with a machete. They have a lovely sense of humor. You may know at African Time, they showed us this ruined church, but they've left this sign up there, and we all go and have a good look at it and a good laugh, because Africa Time is Africa Time, and I ought to have it above my desk. The school, St. Andrew's School in Plateau State, were there, and when it rained, you got soaked to the skin, but now there's a lovely new school we're helping to build, and the dynamic, wonderful head teacher with his handmade, homemade visual aids. I must say the maths was too advanced for me to understand. The lovely kids, and it's a really happy school. And in another part in Kano State, which is a Sharia state, we're helping with a primary school. A year ago, there were 6 kids and 1 teacher. Now there are 189 kids and 6 teachers. I love kids, as you can see. But very briefly, as I draw to conclusion, we could talk about the other areas where we're working. We work in India, we're working in East Timor. In 10 days' time, I leave to go out to East Timor and back to Eastern Burma. I'll take any messages you may want me to take back to Chiang Mai or to Pastor Simon. But you know, when you work with local people and you give them the dignity of doing the work for themselves, their own communities, you don't need megabucks. We can do all this in relatively small budgets. And as I finish, our little motto. You know, sometimes you must feel this. We feel it very often. When you look around the world, there's so much need at home and abroad, you just don't know where to begin. You can always feel paralyzed. But this is our motto. Okay, I cannot do everything, but I must not do nothing. And if all of us do something, together we really can make a difference. So thank you for letting me share a little bit of the pain and the passion of our work with some of our heroic, amazingly full of grace brothers and sisters in some of the darker parts of the world. And congratulations on what you're doing here at Pepperdine. Thank you.
Please take a seat here, and we'll If you have questions, please pass them to the aisles and we'll bring them down and respond to them.
Just while you do, I only accept that applause for them. They're the real heroes and heroines. Do I need to keep the mic on? Probably.
Yes, please. My name is Professor Roger Alford, and I am the spokesperson for all of these students. And there's many, many wonderful questions. Several of the students have asked the question about how you got started in this business. This past May, Gary Haugen spoke and basically gave a message that every person needs to have a purpose in their life, and that the goal is to try to identify that purpose and then live it out. How did you identify this as your purpose in your life?
Well, thanks for the question. I can claim no credit for intentionality, but I do have a little sort of principle that I think has developed as I go through life, and I've had many years to develop it in. But I think if God opens a door in front of you, or a door suddenly opens in front of you, which is not something that I contrived, it wasn't my ambition, I didn't manipulate it, you know, you ought to go through that door, because you'll have no idea what's on the other side unless you do go through it. If you do go through it, then new horizons will open up, new people you'll meet, and you will find opportunities expanding and expanding. And for me, it really began way back in the 1980s, when our kids had just begun growing up and leaving home, and I just got this strange title of Baroness. And so for one of the doors that opened up for me, it was after I got the title Baroness, you're sometimes asked if you'd be a patron of organizations. And this was when Poland was going through a very dark time under communism. You might remember, some of you old enough to remember, Lech Walesa and the Solidarity leader of Poland in those days, and sent out an SOS because he knew his people were really going to suffer. And one response in Britain was setting up an organization called Medical Aid for Poland Fund. They asked if I'd be a patron. I said honored, but only on the condition that, as appropriate, I could travel on the trucks with the medical aid in order to make sure the aid arrived, and also to come back and say, I've been, I've seen, this is how it really is. So I found myself living the life of a truck driver. And in those days, there were no hotels or motels in Poland. You lived on the truck with your truck driver for a week, and I can tell you the top bunk of a 32-ton truck is about this wide. You can't lie on your side. You can't read. And in the winter, when it was cold and the windows were shut at night, and your truck driver smoked poisonous Polish cigarettes all night, it was slightly challenging, but nothing like the suffering of the Polish people. And I came back every time humbled and inspired by their dignity, their generosity, their courage. But for me, that's when the pain and the passion were born. The important principles, if we're in the whole world of aid or advocacy, of going in person when you can, and also be able to come back then and say, I've been, I've seen, this is how it is. Accountability and advocacy were born then.
A related question, what is the scariest situation that you have ever experienced? And I just want to add on to that. And then how do you keep going after you've encountered that sort of experience?
The problem is which one? Okay, one. We didn't visit it this afternoon, but Carrie came with us. The little Armenian enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh, which is part of ancient Armenia, that Stalin, with his salami tactics, used to dislocate people, literally. And he cut off part of eastern Armenia, stuck it inside Azerbaijan as a little enclave. And Azerbaijan, in the turbulent days of the collapse of the Soviet Union, began ethnic cleansing the 150,000 Armenians from that little land. I've just come back from my 69th visit there. A lot of those were during that bitter war in the early 90s. And on one day we were driving, the little capital city is Stepanakert. I used to count 400 Grad missiles every day pounding in on that little city. How do you count 400 easy Grad, multiple missile rocket launcher, fires 40 missiles in every body, 10 lots of Grad, 400 missiles every day on that little city. But then they started using Grad against villages outside, and actually it's a war crime, because Grad is a weapon of indiscriminate destruction, shouldn't be used on civilians. Anyhow, we knew that a village called Shosh had been attacked. We tried to get an ambulance there. It was April, the ambulance kept getting stuck in the mud. Eventually we got there. We found a scene of complete devastation. On the way back, we were driving in our Jeep, or kind of a Soviet edition of a Jeep, and on this windy road, and it was April, and it was slush and mud and snow and hairpin bends, and suddenly the shells started falling all around us. And someone suddenly said, hey, we're the target. We obviously were. And about 20 shells fell all around us. One exploded so near the back of the Jeep that the whole thing lifted up. But eventually, after about 2 miles driving like that, and 20 shells plus, we got round the shoulder of the mountain, back safe. And all I would say is we were saved by 2 miracles, a brilliant Armenian driver and an absolutely lousy Azeri gunner. But we also have a little motto, we don't believe in miracles, we rely on them, and I could tell you so many miracles. Invite me back and I'll give you a lecture on miracles.
And then how do you keep going in your work after you've had these sorts of near-death experiences?
Well, I think for those of you who've been, like some of you have been to Melan, met the Karen, when you're there, it's such a privilege. And I remember once I was about to go back to Karabakh, maybe it was a visit after that one, and very often before I do go on these visits, and not even just going to war zones, but as some of you again will know, you're going out of your comfort zone. You're going to a part of the world where you could pick up a nasty bug, you can get maybe malaria, you may be able to get salmonella, food poisoning. You're going out of your comfort zone, and sometimes you shrink a bit at the prospect. But going into an active war zone, I used to shrink big time. I used to have what I call my fit of faithless, fearful dread. I remember one Saturday afternoon before going into Karabakh, when it was an active war, I got one of my fits of faithless, fearful dread. I didn't tell the family about it, there's no point in spreading gloom and doom, but I was feeling pretty horrible. Went to church on Sunday morning, and the gospel reading was that passage, "He who is not prepared to leave husband, wife, brothers, sisters for my sake isn't worthy to be my disciple." There was an extra bit that I'd never noticed before. I'm not sure I've ever noticed it again. It was there that day anyway. But he who does leave husband, wife, brothers and sisters for my sake will find new brothers and sisters even under persecution. And we just found such wonderful brothers and sisters that when you're there, it's a privilege to be with them, and you come back knowing you receive more than you can ever give. So I just say for people who do have that fit of faithless, fearful dread, go beyond that horizon of fear. We all have it. It's inevitable. You're going to have that anxiety. You're going to have that fear. But if you go beyond that boundary of fear, then I think you, like me, will find wonderful people, wonderful experiences, and you'll be glad you did it.
A question about the relationship between religion and conflict. On the one hand, often conflict is religiously motivated, but on the other hand, people like yourself are often motivated by religious impulse to try to help those in need. Can you speak about the connection between religion and conflict, as well as conflict resolution?
Well, very hard to generalize because there are so many different causes of conflict and so many different types around the world. And of course, conflict is as old as the history of humankind. Therefore, there seems to be a long pattern of war and conflict as far back as we can look. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised that our generation is any different. I mean, we should perhaps expect conflict. In some of the aspects of conflict which I've witnessed, and some of you may well have encountered this directly or indirectly, there is also, I think, a particular dimension of what I can only call real evil. Some of the massacres which we know have been perpetrated, again, I think they can only be designated in terms of some aspect which in their gratuitous, horrific, systematic, intentional brutality, I can only call as evil. For me, that challenges my theology. And sometimes it challenges my theology, particularly when, as a Christian, one believes in a God of love, and just very briefly a personal response to how my religion tries to cope with that dimension of conflict. I'm not talking about a just war where you may have to defend your own people, but I'm talking about gratuitous violence, which I can only put in this category, which is inexplicable except in terms of some form of evil. And I remember I've been walking through those killing fields in Sudan, and we just got a glimpse of them this afternoon. But I can tell you, when you've walked through them again and again, and mile after mile of cattle corpses, but human corpses, children slaughtered, women, pregnant women disemboweled, their babies taken out, real horrors of what man can do to man. And after this particular visit, it was a particularly gross one, and at the end I was sitting on my sleeping bag. We didn't have houses, you live in a tent with a sleeping bag, and I was just weeping. And my faith was really challenged. And then I thought to myself, well, maybe one of the ways why, or one of the reasons why, we in the West perhaps find it difficult to have a theological way of responding to, of understanding this aspect of conflict, is reflected, funnily enough, in the way we keep Christmas. Now, I'm all for celebrating Christmas. Of course we celebrate Christmas. As Christians, it's wonderful that God became human, that love divine became love incarnate. I mean, a wonderful, wonderful, unbelievably indescribable miracle to celebrate, or miracle but act of grace to celebrate. But while we're celebrating, and right that we should, very often our Christmas is also very cozy, and right that they should be happy. But we tend to forget in our celebrations and our Christmas parties and presents and decorations that while Mary was celebrating the birth of Jesus, a lot of other mums were weeping because their babies had been slaughtered by Herod. And we don't put that into the factor of our keeping of Christmas. And while we turn our back in our own theology against man-made suffering, and we don't engage with it theologically, it is not surprising when we confront it, we don't quite know how to handle it. And one of my pleas is that I think in Western Christendom, we need to develop much more, shall I say, sensitively and as a matter of some urgency, a theology that can cope with this whole aspect of human nature and human suffering. And I don't think we've got it in our contemporary theology. I think we need it. For my own thinking after that, I didn't get very much further in that challenge to my faith, because I did think about Mary and at the end of Jesus' life, when all she could do was he had that agonizing death on the cross, was to stand at the foot of the cross and be with him as he died in anguish, and she must have been there in agony. And maybe a part of any Christian's calling must be to be willing to attend whatever Calvaries our Lord may call us to attend, to feel as hopeless and helpless as Mary felt as her son died, but at least to be there in pain, in grief, in deep respect. And maybe when we're there at those Calvaries, we'll find a little more insight into the mystery of suffering, into the mystery of reconciling love, and the mystery of the nature of God. And that's as far as I got that afternoon in my sleeping bag, but it was a little bit helpful.
We have several questions about how can I, as a student, an undergraduate student or a law student, have a career like this. There's in this audience professors and ministers and mission directors and all that sort. Can you describe a little bit about if someone wanted to participate actively rather than just providing money, what they could do?
Well, I'd love to engage with anyone who wants to think about this. It's not for me ever to give an answer to that question, because, again, as a Christian, I believe God, I have a wonderful God up there, and he's got better ideas about his possibilities for you than I can ever have. What we can do is offer you an opportunity to engage with us, to discuss with us, to travel with us, like Kerry traveled with us. And it's wonderful that my wonderful colleagues Lee Miller, who's setting up Heart US. She's an attorney, for those who are lawyers. She's served as an attorney many presidents since Eisenhower. That'll tell you how young she is. But she's a wonderful attorney, and she is giving her time pro bono to establish Heart US. And Sona is also a wonderful colleague, hoping to set up a Heart US. We've now got Heart US as Heart UK. If you wanted ever to travel with us on one of our visits, I know Pepperdine arranges your visits, so you may not need that, but I'd say one form of, if you like, testing your calling or seeing the way in which it might appeal to you or suit your particular personality, the gifts you've got, is to go what I call a taster visit. Not necessarily suddenly to go wholesale into a long-time placement in one of these parts of the world, but visit. The fact you visit will do two things. It'll be a great comfort for those people you do visit, because the kind of people we've been talking about, they do often feel forgotten. It came up very clearly on your very powerful video. The fact you care enough to go will be a blessing to them. You don't necessarily have to take anything specific in terms of professional skills. The fact you're there will mean a lot to them. You care enough to leave your comfort zone. You care enough to go. And when you come back, you'll be able to be an advocate for them. So I would say, go on a visit. The ones we arrange in Heart are not very lengthy visits. You know, for us from the UK, 10 days is often a long enough turnaround. Long enough to travel there, to meet the people, to assess their situation, to begin to feel the pain and the passion, to be able to come back and talk about them. And also when you go through that open door, then you'll get other relationships, other opportunities will open up, which will show you your way forward through whatever doors God may want you to go through in your life, or if you're not a Christian, whatever your professional commitments may be that you want to develop.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Lee A. Miller at att.net. L-E-E-A Miller at att.net.
All lowercase.
Let me ask you a related question to the idea of these short travels abroad. It seems a little self-indulgent sometimes to spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to go to one of these places and do a week or two of work. Why do that rather than just give the money to a local aid group?
Yeah, thanks for a question which a lot of people, I think it's a very rational question, a very valid question, do agonize about. Is it better to give the money where it can make a difference in terms of some practical intervention, or to go? My answer is always unequivocally, please go. Because, okay, that $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, I mean, you can do a lot. You can build a primary healthcare clinic in southern Sudan. So I'm, in a way, cutting off my own nose to spite my own face, as we say in England, by saying this, don't give money to an aid organization, but go. But if you go, then, as I've said, you will, A, be a blessing to the people you visit, so your presence will be as precious to them as a gift in kind. When you come back, you can have a massive ripple effect, because you can come back and you can talk about it. And as you talk about it, A, you can raise awareness for any political needs or advocacy needs that they have, but you can also help to raise money for them with a much more valid and robust way than if you're just doing it reading reports or listening to me nattering to this afternoon. It'll be your mission, your authenticity, and that'll be well worth $3,000 or $4,000. And it'll go on for a lifetime.
Last question. You truly do live in two worlds. Do you think it is easier for you as a Christian to live in the world of darkness or in the world of light?
Well, the world of darkness is a very challenging place to be. If by darkness we mean those people who are suffering persecution, oppression, some of the kind of scenes we've seen. But very often, when you're with our brothers and sisters there's more joy than in many a comfort zone in the West. And as it says in the Bible, the light shines in the darkness has not put it out. And very often, as I say, in the radiant faith, when people worship, they worship with such exuberance, such passion, such joy, much more exuberance than many a comfortable church in the West. I'm sure your own church is excluded from that generalization. But you often find more joy, more light in the darkness, and sometimes you find more darkness in what we might think are the light parts of the world. And I find that very often I get much more inspiration, much more strengthening my own faith, much more, endorsement of my passion for human rights, for justice, when I'm where it's at, than I do in the comfort-filled and the often trivially obsessed world of the West. And I would look at your American television for half an hour, and I mean, British television isn't all that brilliant, but I mean, your television, I don't see anything any time at all. That CNN, obviously, you get news programs, but I couldn't get a news program, so I saw about 100 other channels. I've just been staying. And if that's what fills people's minds, then what I would say is, I think the darkness is often in the comfort zones of the West, and the light is in the dark parts of the world.
That's wonderful. Let's thank Barroness Cox.
Thank you very much.